Hey, I'm Aqlex. This is going to be a meandering video about some of my thoughts on Fire Emblem Engage, video games, and storytelling, but mostly Fire Emblem Engage. Now, I want to start off by saying that I don't normally make these kinds of videos, and I don't really have any intention of making more of these kinds of videos, but for some reason, Nintendo's Fire Emblem Engage, which released in 2023, struck a particular nerve with me, and I've felt the need to get my thoughts about it out. So I decided, what the heck? A YouTube video it is, since that's what all the cool kids do these days. Alright, let's begin with a tiny bit of background on me for context. I work as a freelancer in the film industry. I love storytelling of all forms, both experiencing them and telling stories myself. I spend a bunch of my time writing scripts for short and feature-length films, like little personal projects I mean. Despite working on films for a living, I also have a lot of appreciation for video games, and I spend a lot of time playing or thinking about them. It's a younger medium than film, which itself is a younger medium compared to some of the ancient classics like literature or painting. I'm fascinated by mediums. I love thinking about how one medium works differently than another, and what traits they each have that make them similar or unique. Video games are one of these mediums, and they're one of the ones that I spend more time with than many others. There's a strange thing where, somehow, in the year of our Lord 2023, some people, particularly of older generations, still refuse to believe that video games are art. Somehow, many of these people will accept that Marcel Duchamp signing a mass-produced urinal in 1917 and calling it art is in fact art, but video games aren't? That's just strange to me. The part about how some people refuse to label video games as art, I mean, not that part about a signed urinal being called art. I actually do believe that is art. Having gone to art school myself and seeing the wide variety of things people apply the art label to, then hearing them defend why it is in fact art, has convinced me that the lines between art and not art are very gray and murky, and has honestly left me in the camp that almost anything is art if we choose to label it as such. Anyway, let's set that aside. Video games are art. Done. Let's talk for a quick moment about my gaming experiences. I've played games since I was maybe 10, probably a little earlier. The first thing I owned was Wario Land 3 on the Game Boy Color. I play a lot of video games, sort of. I work a lot and tend to focus on my personal projects a lot more than burning through a backlog of video games, so I really only play a couple of games a year at most, on a good year. I've played Nintendo games more than anything else, though not exclusively. I really dislike first-person games for some reason. They just feel wrong. They just don't move like a human moves, and it feels like a constant immersion-breaking dissonance for me. I also don't care for shooters, or most games that involve guns in general. I just don't enjoy guns, I think, maybe. This has left me playing a lot of RPG and JRPG stuff, and platformers and strategy games. My favorite series is the Pikmin series, though my favorite game might be Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild. About Fire Emblem, I haven't played too many of them, but my first game was Awakening on the 3DS years ago, and I quite enjoyed it until the ending, where the story pulled some moves that left such a bad taste in my mouth that it soured my entire experience of the game. I really like stories, by the way, and the way I feel about video game stories colors a lot of my experience of a game. Years later, I tried Three Houses, deciding to give Fire Emblem another go. I remembered how much I had fun playing Awakening, but I remembered that I really disliked the story. So this time, I came in making sure that my expectations for the story were low, so that I wouldn't get so burned by it again. However, the beginning of the game was actually quite engaging from a story perspective, and I accidentally found myself invested in the story and characters. This was a bit of a mistake, because in the second and third acts, the game largely tripped over itself and forgot to pay off its own setups or make well-considered and meaningful choices. I did play the Black Eagle's Edelgard route, which, just FYI, I've heard is the most badly written route, so that's something to consider. However, I don't think this is an excuse. Most people are only going to play one route, and it seems that the Edelgard route was maybe one of the most common routes played. So the game should really try to put its best foot forward, and I don't think Three Houses did this. I'd love to talk about this more, but this video isn't supposed to be about Three Houses. I'll end this section by saying that I was once again turned off from playing any more Three Houses because of the writing. I mean, going back to play more routes or the DLC. The writing of the part I played bothered me so much that I could not bring myself to play more. But I felt like they had made some significant strides. I do remember enjoying at least the setup of the story and the characters much more than I had in Awakening. At the end of it, my thought was, wow, maybe they can actually really get their shit together for the next game. Maybe if they only wrote 1 or 2 routes, rather than splitting their resources among 4 different routes, they could really have something. With that said, let's get into talking about Engage. So, I bought Fire Emblem Engage just about when it came out. I wasn't hyped for it, though my partner was, so it was on my radar. It came out at the right time, right as I finished up another game and was trying to decide what to play next, And because I remembered that I felt like Three Houses was so close to actually having a decent story, I felt like the Fire Emblem team would come at Engage with everything they learned from their shortcomings on Three Houses. How I wish that was the case. The first moments of Engage were actually slightly hopeful. Our protagonist, Aqlex, was actually given a voice and allowed to speak, which I felt was a huge step up from Byleth in Three Houses. I personally find silent protagonists to be pretty awful and super immersion breaking. Some people think they're supposed to help us somehow step into the character's shoes and feel like we're the protagonists, but I basically find the opposite to be true. When a character speaks, is voice acted by a human and behaves like a fellow human being, I can empathize and identify with them and their struggles. When your protagonist stands around in a group of people who are all speaking and asking you questions, and your character only waves around their hands or makes some and noises, it breaks all immersion for me, especially when everyone then reacts as if your character has said something genius or profound. I suddenly feel like this is a lame puppet that I have very little control over, and that this puppet should instantly be rousing alarms from the characters around them. Who is this weird robot puppet of a human that doesn't act anything like a human? When this mute character does anything, I often just think, who the hell is this person, and why are they making such a stupid decision or not asking questions about why the hell they have amnesia? Because it's always goddamn amnesia. When a character speaks and sounds like a real human being and makes a decision I think isn't the best, I'm much more likely to actually give them the benefit of the doubt and maybe even understand where their decision came from. Anyway, giving Aqlex a voice was, in my opinion, one of the exact right moves that I wanted Engage to make after learning from their mistakes in Three Houses. They did, however, start with a goddamn amnesia plot, which, by the way, is a storytelling device I would prefer we just put a blanket ban on for a decade, because it's just a lazy storytelling crutch that is rarely utilized well and often just goes hand in hand with bad writing. I'm not saying it can't be done well, I'm just saying that most people that use it don't know how to write, usually, so it's not used well in most cases. Anyway, the use of this amnesia trope was a real strike against them, but I can't throw the entire game out of the window because it happened to use a single trope. I've got to give it the benefit of the doubt and allow it a few tropes. Alright, I don't want to only talk about story, by the way. I know that video games are about more than just the story, so let me actually sidestep the storytelling for a moment and talk about some of the other aspects that make Engage tick. When I was first set free in the Somniel, I was quite excited. I ran around and I noticed it was a smaller map than the Three Houses Garreg Mach Monastery map. This was good because I really grew tired of running around the large, bland Garreg Mach map between every battle, and I ended up dreading my in-between battle time in that game. I would have a fun battle, and then the game would slow to a crawl as I would run around a large map, check for new shiny spots where items have appeared, then repeat the same set of cooking and greenhouse and fishing activities again and again and again. I grew to dread needing to come back to Garreg Mach, which was kind of unfortunate because I really enjoyed a lot about it. I kind of liked its Hogwarts-style vibe I was getting from the fantasy castle where all these students had come to learn and I was hanging out with them as my peers. Yes, I was their teacher at the same time and that was super problematic, but that's not for this discussion. I wanted to spend more time in the castle and with the students, but I needed them to find a way that was less draggy and repetitive than this. I wanted this experience to somehow be distilled further. And at first glance, the Somniel was that. The map was smaller, the graphics were cleaner and more polished, the support conversations were snappier somehow too, and your running animation looked much less broken and awkward than in Three Houses. It felt initially like a more distilled version of Garreg Mach. In some ways, there was more to do too. There was a ring cleaning minigame and a little farm with animals you could raise and a working out minigame. It felt like there was more you could do somehow. I just mentioned the graphics, but I'll touch on that again. The game looked better, in quotation marks, than Three Houses. It had a more stable frame rate and far less of an aliasing problem, though I personally didn't care for the more colorful and ridiculous character designs. Ultimately though, by the end of the game, I really grew to hate this art style and felt that Three Houses, however less polished its art style was, did manage to find a more unique and consistent style to its world and characters that Engage never did. Engage feels like a mishmash of bright colors and anime waifus that didn't even seem to come from the same world. On to the battles, however, I was having fun with the Engage battles. They were great, and I looked forward to these. I was having trouble finding my favorite characters that I wanted to keep using, however, and sadly, this never got resolved. In Three Houses, I really grew to like the characters in my house because of how they were written and their arcs and struggles and personalities, and wanted to keep using them for this reason. But Engage never got me interested in any of the characters, so I didn't care about actually sticking to using any of them in particular. But even despite this, the battles were quite fun, and I'll give the game that. That part of the gameplay was a good time. Alright, I'm already done with the non-storytelling aspects of the game. I want to return to the story again. As you can see, I'm struggling to not talk about it, even when I'm talking about how much I enjoyed battles, but not the characters in the battles. This is some of the fundamental problem I want to talk about with the game. The story is, and let's not mince words here, really, really awful. It is shockingly bland and flawed and unconsidered and random and ridiculous, but not ridiculous in a The Room so bad it's good kind of way, just in a way that leaves you so bored and so tired of playing this game. The story doesn't have a single original idea in it. It essentially has no world building and no characters. I mean, yes, there is a world, and there are characters, but only because when you need to create a 3D environment for a player to move around in, it inevitably is a world. And when you need a character model to walk around in those environments, and you decorate it with random clothes and colors that don't seem to match other characters with the same backgrounds, you've still technically created a character, but not really. These are bland placeholders that you can assign a random name and a random personality trait, maybe two, but God forbid if you give them any depth beyond that. Boucheron, he cries a lot and likes reading. Amber, he likes alpacas and legends. Clan, he's obsessed with the divine dragon, and he likes pickles. Chloe, she has just absolutely unacceptably giant boobs. Oh, that wasn't one of her personality traits? Forgive me, but whoever modeled the character and whoever set the camera angles on the cutscenes forgot that this wasn't her only character trait. I guess she also likes folk food and fairy tales. But whoops, we've maxed out on character traits. That's it, that's all you get. Let me complain more specifically about the characters for a moment. For all of my story problems with Three Houses, one thing I now see that it actually excelled at, now that Engage has provided a clear counterexample, was characters and character writing. Each character was compelling in their own way in Three Houses. They all had their own stories, they all seemed to follow their own internal logic, they had their places in the world, and each felt like they had some larger arc that would reach some conclusion by the end of the game. Engage has basically none of this. A few characters have unique ways of speaking, and oh boy do they have unique ways of speaking.
I am melting wax with which I will produce candles. You are interesting.
But outside of being allowed one or two personality traits and or interests, and having a quote-unquote unique voice, most characters go no further than this. Not one of them engaged me. Some people like Yunaka, but I honestly found her to be the bare minimum of a character, while most of the other characters weren't even characters at all. Another character of mild interest was, I don't remember her name, Girl Joker, who came from neglectful and abusive parents and had to take her life into her own hands and slowly grow to pretend to be higher class so she can fit in and have a proper life for herself among the nobles. But she still has no real arc. Basically no character does. Maybe there were some that I missed in supports, but I feel like I should have found these arcs outside of the supports, because they should have been more important to the story rather than extra fluff crammed into side content. I actually feel like these writers forgot a key part of writing: research, or at least drawing from experience. Like, almost none of these characters seem to actually even know anything about their own interests. Amber, despite really being into alpacas, doesn't actually seem to, know anything about alpacas. Like, he just likes mentioning their name and then, making some noises once in a while that supposedly are alpaca noises. But, that's about it. Bonet is a great example. He's supposedly a chef, though I'm very skeptical of this. He first meets Alir and says something like, "Wow, one of your eyes is like a tomato, and the other is like a blueberry." Because he's a chef, get it? Chefs only talk about fruits and vegetables. Didn't you know that? Yeah. Then Alir is like, "Thanks?" And Bonet says, "Oh, this is because I'm a chef, and I'm steeped in culinary traditions from around the world."
You have the most evocative eyes. This one's like a cherry tomato. Oh, and that one, a blueberry.
Thanks.
I am steeped in culinary traditions from all over the world, ergo my penchant for food analogies.
What? Is that why you know blueberries are blue? It's just dumb. Then, to add insult to this writing injury, and who knew you could get an injury from writing, Alir says something like, "Wow, you're such an impressive chef. You know so much about food from all around the world."
How impressive, Bonet. to know about so many dishes from around the world.
Literally WTF. This man just mentioned blueberries are blue, and you're impressed? This is not how any humans would ever conduct a conversation, and in particular, a person knowing that blueberries are blue is not proof that they're a chef or even know a damn thing about cooking. Then on top of that, Bonet keeps showing up and wanting to taste things like rocks or your sword. This is mildly amusing, but only barely. It's just mostly nonsense. This chef is rarely seen cooking anything, eating anything, or even actually talking about cooking. I think I ran into a single support between him and Fagato, where he actually cooked him a fish. Fagato says, "Oh, it's pretty good," and Bonet replies, "I cooked the fish with salt." That was his secret ingredient, salt, by the way.
This grilled fish is divine.
I added a pinch of salt.
It's almost funny, except that it's not really written as if it's a joke, and nobody laughs. You know, it's just, everybody accepts it. Another character to quickly mention here is Jade. She's a writer, supposedly, because she constantly says something like, "I should write about this." But she doesn't actually seem to behave like any writer I've ever met. When you beat the game, a paragraph of text tells you that she's written 100 books in her lifetime. That's just hilarious to me. They just picked the number 100 because it sounds impressive, I guess. But look at some of the most prolific writers of our time. Stephen King is 75 years old, not a soldier in a war, by the way, and has managed 65 novels so far in the course of his life, which is super impressive. But 100 is just a joke. I mean, I'm not saying no human's ever done this, but it's just too random and dumb a number, and it just doesn't even feel properly realistic. This is particularly strange to me because the people writing this game should presumably know something about writing. At least when they didn't know anything about chefs or cooking, I could assume it was because the writers don't really do much cooking, so they just don't know anything about it. But they seem to be equally oblivious about what the craft of writing is like, even though they are actively engaging in it themselves. This, again, is almost funny, except that Jade says these things very seriously. I don't think this is supposed to be a comedy. There are no tongue-in-cheek qualities to the writing or line delivery. Every character takes everything they say and everything that is said by anyone else at face value in this game, and everyone takes themselves super freaking seriously. I think therein lies maybe my biggest problem with the writing. It's super boring and bland and sleep-inducing, and it takes itself super seriously. There are some 8 hours of main cutscenes in this game, or at least important dialogue, and then I expect there are several more hours just in support conversations alone. That's a decent chunk of your playtime with this game. Then I found myself to spend just as much time at the Somniel as I was spending in battles, which was tragic, because I grew to hate the Somniel and its activities much more quickly than Three Houses is. And, I mean, I hated the Three Houses activities by the end of my playtime, but it took me a little while to really grow tired of them. With the Somniel, I mean, the third time I was back there, I was already done with it. I hated the minigames, the long load times to take me to the freaking ring chamber and Coliseum. By the way, couldn't you guys not use all these new assets so the game has to load them all up instead of just make them fit into the current environment you're in? And I know it maybe would have looked a little less pretty, but it would have kept things moving along. My God, that would have been so much better. The fishing mechanic that just wasted so much of my time. Sidebar, the fact that the final circle shrinking down until you can hit the A button in the fishing minigame doesn't actually do anything is infuriating. You can't miss or do a perfect or okay button press. It's just an animation that you need to watch, and you can hit A when it's done, and it doesn't change your chances of catching the fish or improve its quality or anything. It is literally just wasted time. This is a real pet peeve of mine in video games. Coming from a film background and spending a lot of time in the edit room, we literally debate shaving things down by a mere 24th of a second at times. We are so conscious of the audience's time and attention. We spend a lot of time trying to nail this and keep everything moving along and not spending a moment longer in a scene than feels necessary. Video games, though, I feel like they haven't learned how to do this yet. And especially not Fire Emblem Engage. The fishing minigame is so long and contains several sections where you're just watching animations, the same ones over and over. You can end up fishing hundreds of times in this game. So can we please not have literal hours of our playtime be taken up by watching the same slow and pointless animation hundreds of times? Or whenever you go to Pet Sami, it's just the slowest animation I can remember from my recent time with video games. He shakes his butt and poops out some bond shards, and then you just sit there mashing the controller for what feels like 10 seconds before some invisible animation is finally timed out and you're allowed to exit this mini game, quote unquote. A lot of things in here quote unquote are mini games, but my god, they are not. It's just a time waster where you actually don't have to press anything, you just wait for an animation to be done. It's like some terrible phone game that wants you to pay real money to keep moving along faster and, calls things gameplay or mechanics, but they're actually just sitting there and waiting for stuff to happen. That's what this feels like, except this isn't the phone game. When you play the dragon on-rails shooting minigame, you can destroy every single target, and then you need to sit there and wait for 10 seconds while the dragon continues on the rest of its trajectory and makes it to the defined end point before you can finally get a congratulations screen. Please, please, please stop wasting our time like this, developers. It is driving me crazy and seriously making me want to put down the controller and do something else sometimes. I'm of the opinion these days that video games need an equivalent of an editor as part of the team. This was acceptable when you were a little baby medium, just finding your footing, but you've grown up too much at this point and are spending too much money to be getting away with this shit. You need an editor. Someone that not only considers how the story at large might warrant some editing, as Engage seriously does, but how individual moments in the game should be skippable, or might need trimming, or might be taking too long, or just wasting the player's time. Return us to the fun or engaging part of the game ASAP. Don't linger on menus and animations when you don't have to. Long ladder climbing animations are a particular pet peeve of mine in this area. I'm truly losing my patience when a game thinks it's a fun secret to hide something at the top of an epically long ladder that takes a literal 3 minutes of real life holding the up button to climb to the top of. Then there are animations or menus that a player will encounter hundreds or even thousands of times in a playthrough, and they just move slowly or are clunky. Some of us are working adults, and we want to be able to squeeze in an hour of playing a video game at the end of a long day, but many times we end up spending half of that goddamn time watching unskippable animations that we've already seen 100 times. Please do something about this game industry. The number of times I would boot up Engage just to run around the Somniel and finish only half of the painful activities there before I had to go to bed, and I would end up feeling so disappointed that I didn't get to actually play the fun part of the game, was astounding and incredibly disheartening. This is the real problem I have with Engage. A portion of the game is fun, but I would say that portion is maybe a third of the game? The other 2/3 are cutscenes and running around the Somniel, both of which I would label as not fun or engaging. It makes it really difficult to enjoy this game. If the story was at least tolerable, and to be clear, I don't think it was, then I could at least be enjoying 2/3 of this game. But also, a good story will just make everything better. As I was saying earlier, if I care about a character, I will be more interested in using that character and seeing all of their supports, and I'll care more if they die in a battle. But man, I could just not care less when one of these insufferable / unfathomably bland characters died. But a good story will infuse meaning into these deaths, and will create new levels of meaning and conflict throughout every interaction and through every system in the game. A good story will be the glue that ties all of the experience together. Unfortunately, in Engage, more than ever before, this glue is lacking, and it's just nothing's doing it. There's no story to do it, and nothing else is doing it either. As I was playing the game, all I could see was a mix of disparate elements and mechanics that didn't really feel like they were designed to work together. And I'm not trying to say that Engage just failed epically in some regard. Most games are just a collection of mechanics that don't even necessarily all seem to fit if you look at them closely enough. But somehow the veil was just lifted on Engage more than for most games. I had trouble actually seeing the working out minigame as anything more than, hey you guys design a working out minigame. Don't worry about how it ties into anything else. It just felt like something that one team created that was unartfully glommed onto something else that a different team created. The entire story felt like a similar mishmash of different elements glommed together. Amnesia? Sure. Parent dies? Sure. Bad guy wants to take over the world? Sure. Random time travel that creates stupid film student level, oh, we actually created the situation we were in. Endless loop paradox? Oh my god, that's another of my storytelling pet peeves. Great, chuck it in. Emblem rings? They make little sense in the narrative, honestly, and we purposely dodge all the questions about them that make it seem like being an emblem ring is really more of an unending and infinite torture nightmare curse, rather than being something good. Zombies? Let's throw that in. Sometimes the zombies are barely sentient and don't have any connection to the person they were before or even any thoughts. Sometimes they're fully aware, but evil versions of their previous souls. Sometimes they're just straight up their previous soul reincarnated with no discernible difference. Whatever the story needs in the moment, just go with it, who cares? That's how they approached it. A friend of mine mentioned how a lead developer of Fire Emblem Engage said in an interview that he just wanted to have a fun anime story this time around. But anime should not equal bland story. A story can be full of tropes and still be fun, or find a unique way to tell that story. It's the same way that people will excuse a movie as, who cares about the story, it's a kid's movie. But come on, we've all seen kids' movies that were really good. Ratatouille comes to mind as a story I think is quite good, regardless of the fact that it's meant for kids. Same thing here, anime story or not, this thing fails to be fun or interesting. I decided to try digging around to find proof of this particular interview quote, and I wasn't able to find it, so I may have been misquoting here. But I did find one that looks like it's probably where this came from. In this quote, the director of the game, Tsutomu Tei, I think, excuse my pronunciation there, says he wanted to simplify the story structure by having one major goal, so that the players can put their full focus into enjoying the tactical gameplay. I think this might be the quote that my friend was mentioning. It's not quite the same thing, but honestly, I feel like they failed at this just as hard. They wanted to simplify the story so people could focus on the tactical gameplay. They didn't do that at all. If they wanted me to focus on the tactical gameplay, then they should have cut back on the story. I think they got mixed up and thought simplified would be the same thing as shortening or de-emphasizing, which is really what the story needed. It feels like if Three Houses was a 100,000 word script with fun characters and some nuanced storytelling, Engage is also a 100,000 word script with awful bland characters and no real storytelling. You can't fill the game with just as much voice acting and cutscenes and then say that you're trying to put more focus on the tactical gameplay. I'm glad the tactical part of the game was fun, but nothing else was. You should have just shaved away the other stuff or distilled it in some meaningful way instead of putting just as much of it there as in Three Houses, but making it blander. That was the wrong way to do it. I feel like I have so much more to say. The Four Hounds are such a waste of time and space. The end of the story is so full of cutscenes that suddenly try to give a bad guy, like Sombron or Zephyia, a backstory of some sort that makes them seem not like such bad guys after all. But falls so flat because no groundwork was laid for these moments. If you want to do this, foreshadow these things earlier so when they do happen, the audience is suddenly like, oh, that's why they were doing X and Y. Now I feel so bad for not noticing earlier. But doing it the way they did it is unearned, boring, tropey, and just wastes the player's time. And it wastes budget, because now you have to pay all the voice actors to do this work, and the people to lay out and animate all these cutscenes. Even if they're just reusing animations, it is still some work to repurpose these animations and you choose all the new camera angles and create all these new supports and even write all the dialogue for them. Instead, you could have spent that time and money tightening up the actual fun part of the game. Just as another example of bad writing, you meet your mom with giant boobs that it later turns out your character isn't actually related to, so it's totally okay to be attracted to her right in the beginning of the game. You basically have a single conversation with her, but you have amnesia, so you don't even remember she's your mom, and then she dies right after. And the rest of the game is you trying to avenge your mom and do right by her, mostly. But this doesn't work when we have no reason to care about this character we met for half a second that just died immediately after. We barely met her, and aren't even really sure she's our mom because our main character has no memories of her. Our main character doesn't care about her. He has no memories of her, outside of the one sentence interaction they had. There's just zero motivation for this entire thing. How can you fail on such a fundamental point of storytelling? Motivation is the foundation that everything else should be built on. I wish I could be more like other gamers that are just able to skip the story or accept bland or tropey stories. I wish I could enjoy things like they do, but some part of me just isn't wired this way. I don't think any medium is allowed to try hard in some areas and then gloss over other areas. All individual aspects are an important part of the whole, and any one part being deficient can and will detract from the whole. If you, as a game developer, really don't want to focus on story, that's fine, then don't. Don't put 8 hours of voice-acted cutscenes in your game. Do a basic Mario, Bowser kidnaps Peach and we need to save her, and just leave it at that with maybe a few random minutes of cutscenes, or just do no story at all, honestly. But half-assing 8 hours of cutscenes is exactly the wrong way to do it, because why would you waste our time and your own budget just to lower the quality of your entire product? If you only have a few moments of cutscenes, just the 30 seconds it takes for Bowser to kidnap Peach, then the expectations are nice and low, and I'm not sitting there waiting for the story to get good. In Engage, I kept waiting for the story to finally get good at some point, because there was clearly so much time and energy and money funneled into the story that you feel like there's gonna be some purpose to this. There has to be. Why else would there be so many hours of it? But nope, that's not the case. It is just wasted time and effort that just makes the entire product worse. There's one more point I want to bring up before I close out for today, because this has been really annoying me. Every other time I've brought up that I did not enjoy the Engage story, everyone says, "Well, you idiot, Fire Emblem stories suck. Didn't you know that? Lower your expectations. Don't expect it to be good." This just annoys the heck out of me. One, just because something sucked, I should never expect them to improve? You know that sometimes when you do something over and over again, maybe something you do for a living, you generally get better and better at it the more you work at it? And meanwhile, another reason this makes no sense is that there are a lot of writers out there. You know that just because one game is written by a specific writer doesn't mean they might not hire a different writer for the next game? A story being bad in a series should not necessitate that every other story is bad. Even if most stories were bad, this doesn't require that all other stories are gonna be bad. In fact, I think Three Houses was actually a good example that showed that Fire Emblem stories can aspire to be better and can improve in some key areas. Even though I think there's a lot that Three Houses did wrong, there are actually quite a few things it did right, and I could clearly see the ways in which a few things just needed a few more drafts and could have become truly great. One of the secret hopes I had for the next Fire Emblem game after Three Houses was that they would just remake Three Houses and retell the story, but with a few more experienced writers on board, and use the art style and engine that had already been built and just improve on them. I felt like if we could iterate on Three Houses with a few more drafts, we could have one of my favorite games of all time. Sadly, Engage decided to just reset most of this stuff and start from scratch in many ways, and we ended up with a far more generic and forgettable game than Three Houses in my opinion. Even though the tactical gameplay was fun, there was just too much other stuff that wasn't. I feel like I'm not alone in how burned I felt by Fire Emblem Engage. I do seriously hope that the team sees the backlash that I've seen out there and reconsiders how they tackle the next Fire Emblem game. Either I think they need to return to the Three Houses model and find a way to keep improving on the engine and storytelling of that style of game, or I think they might need to consider scrapping the return to base and do activities and supports model of recent years entirely, and double down on just the tactical gameplay. I'm not saying there hasn't been some sort of return to base and do activities thing for years now, but it's definitely grown to be a larger and more important piece of what a Fire Emblem game is in recent years. You didn't used to be able to run around at your base to do various activities, you just did them in a menu. And honestly, it might be time to return to that because they're not nailing it here. And if anything, it's getting worse. I feel like maybe we just need to jump from battle to battle, maybe with a quick cutscene in the middle, if you can bother to put some minimal but reasonable effort into the writing. But where we are right now is unsustainable. If this series gets stuck in this current formula with lame in-between battle segments and even lamer storytelling, I think this series is gonna wither on the vine and face the cancellation that nearly happened around Fire Emblem Awakening. Please, Fire Emblem, you can't do this again. Alright, that's the end of it. I have so many more thoughts, but I feel like I've talked long enough. I don't need to make this any longer. I don't intend to make more videos like this, so, you know, don't hold your breath for these kind of things. But I just felt the need to get these thoughts out somehow, and this was the way that worked for me. See y'all again on something else later, probably something animated. Alright, bye.